You might remember that Nigeria-based Islamic terror group Boko Haram was the deadliest terror group in 2015, not ISIS. But we've talked about it before, Lewis. Boko Haram does get less attention than does ISIS. Most of their violence is carried out in Africa. Boko Haram has been involved in thievery, beheadings, mass kidnappings, torching entire villages, really running the gamut. And although it didn't receive too much corporate media coverage, you might remember that 2 years ago, we were reporting extensively about Boko Haram having kidnapped nearly 300 girls from a school in Nigeria. Several dozen of those girls ultimately escaped pretty early on, but most are actually still missing. Looks like that story, it just sort of faded from the corporate media narrative. I guess it wasn't interesting or compelling enough.
I don't really know what the deal is with media coverage and stories like this. Occasionally, you'll have really nasty incidents, even worse than the schoolgirl one, that will receive far less coverage.
Well, in hugely disturbing news, Boko Haram is increasingly using children in suicide attacks. And I sort of use the term suicide carefully because children are blowing themselves up in the blowing up of others. But sometimes it's not even clear the children know they're carrying an explosive, never mind going to carry out a suicide attack. This is a report from UNICEF, which says that there were 4 children used in so-called suicide attacks in 2014. And in 2015, that number went up 11 times to 44 for Boko Haram. The report also says, this is unbelievable, that nearly 1 of every 5 suicide attacks, period, conducted by Boko Haram is using a child, and that in the cases where children are being used, around 2/3 are little girls. The bombers, the youngest bomber so far, and again, the term bomber, not necessarily the right term here, thought to be 8 years old. And as UNICEF regional director said, the UNICEF general regional director for West and Central Africa said, these children are victims, not perpetrators. A UNICEF spokesman also told Reuters, as I mentioned, that not only are the kids usually not going to deliberately blow anything up, including themselves or others, very often they don't even know that they are carrying a bomb on their person. Nothing new, right, about kids being used in so-called suicide bombings. Palestinian militant groups have been doing this all the way back to, at minimum, 2000. From 2000 to 2005, during the Second Intifada, this was relatively prevalent. And then over the last 10 years, the Taliban has also used children in these sort of forced suicide bombings in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So long story short, this is not unusual for Islamic groups, broadly speaking, Lewis, but the surge among Boko Haram's use of this method, very disturbing.
Yeah, and you know what? It's sad, but it makes sense, right? Children are very easy to manipulate. In the case of Boko Haram, oftentimes these are children that have been taken away from their parents who have been killed by Boko Haram. Sometimes they're turned into soldiers, and many of the terrorists we see and fight and are used to had their brains warped when they were quite young.
And that's for those who have any clue at all what they are doing. And as UNICEF mentioned, a lot of these kids don't even know what it is that they're doing. Less political will for the U.S. to get involved with Boko Haram than ISIS. Not that it should, right? Not that the U.S. is the world's police, but there are also a lot of questions, and you've talked about this, Lewis, questions about the Nigerian government. Does the Nigerian government not want to get that involved because of cronyism, or is it more because of fear, or is it some combination of both? We don't really know right now.
Yeah, it's hard to say because they have had some strange reactions to terror attacks by Boko Haram.